This is episode 19. Sure, visually. Of course. Until we didn't know this. If I assume. Yep. So, how do you figure this out?
Oh, I don't know, Vigili. Until I didn't know this.
Of course. So, you're not sure you realize that?
Nope, if I assume.
Of course. So, how do we, cause you assume?
Yep, if you assume.
Of course. So, you're not sure you realize that?
Yep, if you assume.
Of course. So, you have no idea why?
Oh, it does, Vigili. Alright, let me know, okay?
I have no idea. Of course. You're not sure you realize that, visually?
Well, it does, Vigili. Until you notice.
Right, yeah. You sure you realize that?
Oh, it does, Vigili. Until I didn't notice.
Right. So, if you assume.
Yep, if I assume, Vigili.
Of course. So, you have no idea, right?
Well, if you assume, Vigili.
Until I didn't notice. If I assume, right?
Well, if you assume, Vigili. Until you notice.
So, if you assume.
Yep. Until you didn't notice.
Right, yeah. Did I realize that?
Yep, if you assume.
Of course.
Until you notice.
Nope. Because I said so?
Right, yeah. Well, let me know, okay? For some reasons, and I was getting some ideas.
Of course. You're not sure where else that?
Yep, if you assume.
Okay. No sure where else that. For some reasons?
Yep.
Okay. Well, I was gonna know about that from earlier.
Of course.
Not sure you realize that? Well, if you assume.
Of course. You know, Chef Lee?
Well, if you assume, usually. Until you notice.
Right. I did not spoon staff, Lee.
Of course. Until you notice.
I know, right? If you assume.
Yep. If I assume, usually. Until you notice.
Right.
So, you didn't notice? Nope. Okay.
Alright then. I have no idea. So, you're not sure, isn't? Of course. So, you're not sure for some reasons? Okay. I am not sure of Lee. Until we didn't know this. Right. Are you sure you realize that? Of course. I have no idea. For some reasons, right? Okay.
So, I would never could tell.
I don't know. For some reasons, if you consume vigilantly, until you notice.
Right, yeah. I did not spoon that.
Of course.
And you let me know.
Okay, so for some reasons, right? If you consume vigilantly, of course. Until I didn't notice, okay? If I consume vigilantly, if I have no idea. Until I didn't notice, right? If you can see visually. So, you know, sure, where else that visually? Well, it does visually. Until you notice. Right, yeah. Until you notice. Right, yeah. No, sure, visually. Until I didn't notice, right? If you can see him. Of course. Yeah, I have no idea, right? Well, if you can see visually. Until you didn't notice. Right. If you can see visually. Until you notice. But if I can see him, right? I have no idea. Of course. You know, sure, realize that. Yep. If you can see him, of course. Because I said so, okay? For some reasons, I have no idea. Until I notice, right? If you can see him, yep. Until you notice. Right. If you can see him, Julie. Until we didn't notice, right? If I can assume Julie. Until I didn't notice. I know, right? If you can assume Julie. Of course, you're not sure where else that? Yep, if you can assume Julie. Of course. I'm not sure, right? If you can assume. Yep. If I can assume Julie. Of course. You're not sure where else that? Yep, if you can assume Julie. Until I didn't notice. Wait, are you sure you realize that? Yep, if you can see him visually. Of course, you're not sure realize that visually. Well, it does, by the way. So if I can assume visually. Until I didn't notice. I know, why? If you can assume. Of course. Until I didn't notice. Nope, if you can see him. Of course. Until you notice. Nope. Okay. I'm not sure if I realize. For some reasons. Yep. Let me know, okay? Okay. For some reasons, right? Well, if you see him. Of course. Yep.